As you may recall from your Cessna private pilot training, there are only two simple rules for safe flying. And rule number one is illustrated right here. Keep it under control. And rule number two is equally simple. Don't hit anything. That's all there is to it, folks. It's that simple. Everything else is an elaboration of those two rules. But when you're in the clouds, it becomes a lot harder to follow those two simple rules. So here are some tips and hints to help you follow those two simple rules and fly IFR safely. Let's talk about how you follow rule number one, keep it under control. Well, the most important thing you can do to follow rule number one is to have lots of practice, because when you're proficient, it will take less of your attention to keep the airplane under control, and you'll have a lot more attention to spare on getting ahead of things. So try and stay proficient by flying in instrument meteorological conditions as often as you can. And if you don't have much actual IMC where you live or at certain times of the year, grab a safety pilot or an instructor occasionally and go fly with a view limiting device. And while you're doing it, practice some partial panel work. And if you have an instructor with you, some unusual attitude recovery. Because those are two situations that pilots don't get to practice in normal IFR flying, and you could get pretty rusty. And it helps you to stay proficient if you file IFR even when the weather is severe clear, because it keeps you current and practiced on ATC procedures. And when ATC procedures are second nature to you, you'll have much more attention to spare for keeping it under control. Now, when you get in the air, the key to keeping it under control is managing your workload. Use that precious time when you're not busy to get ahead of things, to minimize the workload when you will be busy. And get organized. Lay out all your charts, including VFR charts, so that you'll know where you are in regard to terrain, even when you're being radar vectored. And self-brief your approach as much in advance as you can. And use all your resources. If you have a pilot in the right seat, use that person. He can be very helpful in reading checklists, telling you if your heading or altitude exceeds certain agreed upon limits, or setting up navigation and communication radios. And if you have a passenger in the right seat who is not a pilot, that person can still be very useful by helping you keep the cockpit organized and handing things to you like charts, pens, and flashlights, and reading checklists to you. And if there's no one in that right seat, use that empty seat to organize all the items you might need during the flight. Now, another way to use all your resources is to make full use of George, your autopilot. Most airplanes that are flown IFR very much will have an autopilot. And that's because having a good autopilot is like having a co-pilot. It literally gives you another set of hands. Now, the Cessna 172R has a very helpful autopilot that you can use to hold a heading or track a course while you're getting organized. Now, you don't get to use your autopilot much during your instrument training. That's because your instructor wants to make sure that you have the skills to fly IFR in case it fails. But you should get some instruction on how your particular autopilot works and make sure you use it during your IFR flights. And by the way, don't feel that using your autopilot means you're wimping out and not flying up to, quote, professional standards. If you fly a jet and you do not use the autopilot, your instructor will criticize you for not making appropriate use of your cockpit resources. So once again, make sure that you understand how the autopilot works in your airplane and use it. Now let's cover that all-important second rule, don't hit anything. Well, that means both other airplanes and terrain, neither of which you can actually see when you're in the clouds. Well, the way to avoid hitting other airplanes is to develop procedures that make it easy for you to keep track of and follow your current clearance, what heading and altitude you're supposed to fly, where you're supposed to be going, and what frequency you're supposed to be talking on. Now, we've talked about this before, but you should have a system that works for you. Say, have a habit of setting your heading bug to remind you of your heading. You can set your altitude in some unused piece of equipment like your ADF dial. Or you can write down your clearances with separate columns for headings and altitudes and frequencies. And also make sure you read back all the critical items from a clearance, headings and altitudes and frequency changes. This gives the controller a chance to catch any misunderstanding before it causes a problem. Now, when this is all you can see, the way to avoid hitting the terrain is to have really good position awareness. You know, when you're in the clouds, it's very easy to lose a handle on exactly where your aircraft is located and what it's doing. That's especially true when you're being radar vectored. So keep a positive awareness of where you are, what direction you're headed, and what the terrain is like around you. Now, you'll find that most experienced instrument pilots will have every nav radio in the airplane tuned to something that helps them stay oriented, whether it's a nearby VOR, an NDB, or a localizer course. In fact, as you know, the navs in the 172R have a mode that continually tells you what radial of a VOR you're on. You can keep your number 2 nav set to that if you're not using it for something else. And the GPS in your Skyhawk can be your best help for position awareness. If you put the GPS on the Nav4 page, which is the map page, you'll have a continual picture of where you are in relation to nearby airports and nav aids. Now, even though the GPS does not show terrain, knowing where you are while you're being radar vectored will help you enormously in avoiding that cumulus granite. Now, even if you aren't using your GPS for an instrument approach, you can still enter the airport as your active waypoint, select the OBS mode, then dial in the course for the runway centerline. Now, what you'll see is a line on the map that lets you visualize very clearly your position relative to the runway, and you'll get distance readouts from the airport. When you're flying instruments, things can sometimes get complicated and confusing. Well, no matter how complicated things get, just remember there are only 2 things that you need to worry about. Keep it under control and don't hit anything. Follow these 2 simple rules and you'll almost ensure a long instrument flying career with an equal number of departures and approaches.